Get to the church blind! Get to the church blind! Go! Now!
I'm Pete Mitchell, and he's Peyton Jones, and you're listening to Hardcore Church Planting, the companion podcast to the Church Planter Podcast and Church Planter Magazine. Each week, we'll bring you interviews from planters who are in the trenches making it happen right now. These active church planters bear it all, share their successes, their failures, and what they'd wish they'd known when they were first starting out. Listen in to discover how God is working in their church plant.
Have you ever had to prep a sermon and you just looked at your bookshelf and you didn't have enough of what you needed? Well, you don't have to do that. Go to logos.com. Logos Bible software has everything that you need at pretty much at your fingertips, because you're literally typing stuff in, and with a click of a mouse button, you can open the entire C.H. Spurgeon library. You can look up original languages, word studies. I mean, this thing is like the Lollapalooza of church planting information. You can have a little mini concert in your sermon prep right there. All the greats kind of gathered around and picking their brains and putting them into your sermon. And you want to check out logosbiblesoftware.com. They'll actually make you look smarter than you actually are.
Welcome to Hardcore Church Planting. This is Peyton Jones. I'm your host on today's podcast, and want to start off today by introducing you to a new author that I've been reading, Karen Swallow Prior. She is a PhD, and she is also an award-winning professor of English at Liberty University. She's the author of Booked Literature on the Soul of Me and First Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, Poet, Reformer, Abolitionist, and she writes frequently for Christianity Today and many other periodicals, newspapers, ones you would know, The Atlantic, Washington Post. Honored to have you on the show today, Karen.
It's an honor to be with you.
Awesome. Well, you've written a new book, and that's why I want to get you on here. I was just chatting with you about the fact that I am a book nerd. So my wife is actually a literature teacher. I was the son of two teachers. One was a drama teacher. My mom was an English teacher. And so I saw this book come through, and I read, like I just read Hornby's 10 Years in the Tub, right, which is a book about books, all the books he read. Louis L'Amour, Thoughts of a Wandering Man, you know, all these books from a young age. I've loved books about books. So I am a book nerd, a bibliophile, and you've written this. It's called On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. And I see you got a foreword by Leland Ryken. I even have his book on books. So I was super excited to delve into this. Tell us really quickly, just give us an overview. What's the book about?
Well, as you said, it's a book about books, but it has a framework that I use, which is to talk about the classical virtues, which is really the basis of the good life, which is where the subtitle, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books, comes from. But looking at those virtues through the lens of a different work of literature. So I have 12 chapters, each one focused on a different virtue and a different work of literature that can teach us about that virtue.
I love it. And, you know, it's funny because there are parts in the New Testament where Paul talks about that we should be lovers of the good, right? And when you look at that, he's talking about virtue. And that was very much like an ancient world. You got Plato, his studies on virtue. Can you unpack that a little bit and what the importance of virtue are? Because we're a culture that we don't value that the same. We know that virtue, we find that kind of language in the scripture, but what does it really mean?
That is such an excellent question, because we really have lost the sense and meaning and significance of the virtues. And so I go all the way back I draw mainly from Aristotle. And of course, he was a pre-Christian. So he was, an ancient Greek philosopher, but actually, I think, common grace and natural revelation teach us that wherever we find truth, it's God's truth. And I think Aristotle gave us a lot of wisdom about virtue. And he another word for virtue in the way that Aristotle used it is simply excellence. I mean, Aristotle was not only a philosopher, he was a scientist, and he basically looked at all kinds of species, including the human species, and identified the qualities that make human beings most excellent in fulfilling their purpose or their telos as human beings. And so he identified things like courage and justice and temperance as the things that make a human being most excellent. And he also said that though having those virtues, having those those character traits that are become natural to us because we've practiced them so much, those are what constitute the good life. It's not material possessions, it's not success, it's actually being a good person. And the other thing that Aristotle does with the virtues, which I think is so needed today, is he understands every virtue as being a mean, or the Greeks call it a golden mean, or a moderation between two extremes: an extreme of deficiency of that quality and an extreme of excess. And we live in such a polarized time, and such everything we do is to excess, that we've really forgotten that virtue really is moderation.
I love it. And it's interesting because, Paul really appeals to a lot of this was their culture. They understood some of this language. And here Paul introduces Christ as kind of, hey, you've had these ideals, but here's the one in whom these things were embodied. And so I love, because what you're coming as, you're saying literature, we talk in Reform circles about the means of grace, right? The ways that God communicates his grace to us. And what I love about this is something that you propose, and you say finding the good life through great books. And you talk in the beginning about the way that things are communicated are important as the message itself. And you say that literature is one of the means that God can communicate these things to us. And before I have you respond to that, because I want you to unpack that a bit, it's an important premise to how you lay down each chapter, which is broken into like faith, and then you pick a book, right? Or hope, and then you pick a book, and you say how God might be speaking these things through this book. And I know, I agree with you. All great truth is God's truth. I remember going to a conference, and R.C. Sproul once said that when he gets to heaven, he wants to spend 1,000 years listening to all the great composers' works. Right? Just exploring and enjoying. Then he said, then I want to spend the next 1,000 years going through all the great works of literature. And then I want to spend the next 1,000 years going through all the masterpieces of art, because he says, all of these things I believe will exist for eternity because they brought glory to the Creator. And so he says, I don't think all those things are done. I think they live on, that God breathed, and some of Shakespeare, God breathed. And then you've got Tozer on his knees before God, reading Shakespeare on his knees, asking God to speak to him, through everything he sees. And so I love that you've taken that kind of, I would say Solomon, he compiled Proverbs. Some of his Proverbs were Sumerian, because he saw these in the world, and he said, well, this is truth. And we have those in the scripture now. So talk to us a little bit about how literature is one of the ways that we can find the good life.
Yes, well, I just love what you said. I'm still processing it, and so thank you for sharing that testimony from R.C. Sproul. I had not heard that story, and I love it. So, in addition to the 12 virtues and the 12 different authors and works of literature I look at, I have an introduction, which, as you just mentioned, is devoted to really talking about the approach that I take and why, and also why reading literature, good literature, and reading it well is a gift of God, and can be used by him to form us in our character and our spirits. And that actually is one of the main points that I make in this introduction, the one that you referred to, that it's not just what we read that's as important as how we read it. Because literature, like all aesthetic experience, is something that forms us. I mean, it's the form that makes the difference. And so we read literature differently than we read or we should anyway, then we read a newspaper article or a blog post, or even a devotional, a straightforward kind of devotional, anything that's sort of giving us information. We read literature as an aesthetic experience, which means that we're not just reading it to find out what happens. And by the way, there are entertaining novels that are written that are just about finding out what happens, and there's nothing wrong with those, but those would not generally be considered great literature. Great literature uses language in a way that recreates human experience. And so to read great literature well, we have to pay attention to the language. And that means we read a little bit more slowly. I recommend reading with a pen or pencil in hand to mark and underline and pause and reflect and make comments and interact with the text, just as hopefully we do with our Bibles, because it just helps us to learn more and engage more. And so literature we read for the experience that is recreated through the medium of language and words. And because we're experiencing something vicariously, some other world, some other person's experience, even if it's fictional, we're actually forming our character in the same way that we would in interacting with real people, because literary fiction requires us to make judgments, to make interpretations, to make predictions and assessments, all the things we have to do when we interact with people every day in real life, all day long. We have to make those same kinds of judgments, and literary fiction recreates that experience, and that's why it forms our character the way that it does.
I love that. It's funny because reading for me has been a huge part of my spiritual journey. I mean, I read Fox's Book of Martyrs, and then I read Pilgrim's Progress. These are the first two books I read as a Christian. And, I can remember just feeling like I grew. That's my train. Can't do anything about the train. Could edit that out, but I don't.
No, we live near a train too. And for a second, I thought, what's going on?
My train. I don't feel my train. But, it's funny because for me, I found when I started reading, my spiritual life just catapulted ahead. And I read, I was, like I said, I was raised around great literature, and my grandfather was an author, and my dad was a playwright. And of course I'm an author now. And so, but it was just kind of in my blood. But then I stumbled across a book that was a gem in a secondhand bookshop, a book called Archives in Pasadena. May they rest in peace. But, that shop had a little book out of print from the 50s. And it was illustrations from great works of literature. Now, I was a preacher, and I came across that, and I went, "Oh, now what's this?" And I started. It made me want to read, because they were pulling out these things that were clearly biblical. Like Moby Dick has, over 400 direct references to the Bible. You read that, it's like reading a sermon upon a sermon within a sermon about a Bible study about it. It's crazy, that book. I mean, Frankenstein, all these great works of literature that I found just reinforcing all these things that the Bible teaches. And literature, great literature, I like that you bring up what great literature is, because I think you said it recreates the human experience. And there's that famous quote that says, "We read to know that we're not alone." And as I'm reading, I opened your book. Again, it's called On Reading Well, Karen Swallow Prior, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. As I read through, when I first got it in the mail, I opened it and I went, "Oh no, I haven't read any of these books." Because I started from the back. I did the Japanese way here, where I flipped from the back through, and I'm like, haven't read that, and then I found when I got to the beginning, okay, I've read about half of these. And do you mind if I just go through a few of these chapters here? And
please do. Yes, that would be great.
So just to kind of, you break it up into cardinal virtues, theological virtues, heavenly virtues. And I was really excited to see The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which I think is just such a phenomenal book. You had books by Jane Austen, you had Pilgrim's Progress, you had a lot of books I hadn't read. You had Flannery O'Connor, which my wife would do double backflips over. But you had Yeah, The Road. And I want to just tell everybody, if you haven't read that book, stop what you're doing, stop the podcast, go out, buy that book and read it. I fell in love with that book. It haunted me. And I think great literature does that. Either it touches you, you weep, it haunts you, it stays with you. I want to talk a little bit about that book. What made you pick The Road? And I noticed that you have it as hope.
Yeah. I mean, where would you go to for hope that other than a dystopian post-apocalyptic world where most of the remaining humans are cannibals, right?
No, I never thought about it that way, but that is a very compelling argument.
Well, there, and I just gave away part of the story, but I really do hope people will go out and read it. And by the way, I do want to say, just to answer a question that I get from a lot of people, they'll ask when they see the book, if they haven't read the works, should they read those novels before reading my chapter or not? And the answer is either way, it's fine. I actually wrote each chapter with both audiences in mind, an audience that's read the work and is familiar with it, and an audience that has not read the work. So I want these chapters to serve as introductions for anyone perhaps who hasn't read the work and wants to know if they want to. I try not to give everything away because I am just focusing on certain elements. These are not, comprehensive analyses of the works. But all great, even if you have read it, all great literature by definition is rereadable. So go ahead and reread these works too.
I agree with you. I agree 100% because I read it, and particularly in that one, I didn't feel like you gave it away because it's not in that book. It's not so much what happens as how it happens.
Yes,
and you even kind of there's God is in that book all throughout, in a weird way, and even in the ending. And you didn't really focus on that, which I was really kind of impressed. Like you leave the breadcrumbs, but I feel like if you have read the book, you open up a whole new level. You enhance. Like I got great enjoyment out of reading after the fact, but I did read some of them where I hadn't read the book. And guys, this is a meaty book. Like Karen has done an incredible, like this is a thinking person's book. This is going to teach you to think when you read this. So, okay, back to The Road by Cormac McCarthy.
So, I mean, first of all, just part of the process of writing this book, I had to pick the books I was going to write about. I had to pick the virtues I was going to write about. Then I had to kind of match them up. And so to be completely honest about, the writing process, I knew I was going to write about The Road. So it was kind of like a puzzle because it's one of my favorite books. So I'm like, okay, well, which virtue? So, I have all these notes and all these scratches out in my writing journal, like which work and which virtue or whatever. And so, because there were a couple other virtues I could have matched with The Road as well. But it turned out to be hope, which I think worked out well because, the irony is that this is such a seemingly hopeless world. As I said, it's a post-apocalyptic world. It centers on, a father and his son who don't even have names in the story. And there are other people around, but most of them are not good guys. And most of it, as you said, this is a book not about what happens, although that, that's important and it is redemptive in the end. But it really is a story that's, just like the title suggests, The Road, it is a journey, and it is this journey of between this father and his son. The father is trying to preserve his son's life. I mean, he's trying to preserve his own life, but in order to preserve his son's life, and they're trying to move to a better place where there's a better chance at life. And in this world that seems so bereft of hope and stripped of everything, almost everything that would be good, they find goodness. They find simple things. One of the most famous, I won't give it away, but one of the most famous scenes in the book involves, a can of Coke that the father discovers. They splash in water and find a stash of food and eat like they haven't eaten in a long time. And so I look at what Aristotle, and actually even more so in this case, what Aquinas has to say about hope, because hope is one of the theological virtues. And I think it's so timely for us today because for many reasons people feel hopeless. And the definition that Aquinas gives of hope is that it regards a future good that is possible but difficult to obtain. And that's actually a pretty complicated definition because, it's not the same thing as like wishing for something, or, there's hope that we can have as natural people, just because we are human beings. But then there is also the hope that can come only from God, which is the hope that the Bible talks about. And what I talk about in this book, where God is sort of a lingering but not an obvious presence, but is not really directly part of the story, is that this natural hope that all human beings can access prepares us in some way for the supernatural hope that can only come from God and only be received as a gift from God.
Yeah, I love that. And, as you really unpack, the whole journey, I love the fact that you have, you're interacting with this content on a much deeper level. And one of the things I noticed was, Cormac McCarthy, not just in this work, but I've read No Country for Old Men, which is also a film, which kind of tells you maybe I'm choosing. I like to read the book before I see the movie. It's just I'm weird that way. But in both of those stories, God it's almost like he communicates God through his absence. Through his seeming like he's not there, which is why I like that you linked that book to hope, because at times the father really doesn't have hope. He's got that gun in his pocket. Well, maybe I shouldn't talk about that. Let them read that part. But that leads me to my next book which I have to confess was Silence, by Indo, and a Japanese author, and became a film as well. And I'll confess, I didn't fully get that book. And you mention in your chapter about how people really polarize on, there's you mentioned the 3 ways that people interpret the whole book, which I found fascinating, because in my own mind, as I was reading the book, I was going back and forth. What's he trying to say? And I love the fact that you identify this and you use it as faith. But I literally felt, Karen, that reading your chapter on that actually helped me understand this whole book and movie I watched, and was like, I don't get it.
Well, as an English professor, that makes me so happy. That's my job, is to help readers get it. So thank you. I'm very glad.
It was probably my favorite chapter in your book for that reason, because it was really a breakthrough for me. And I got to be honest, I'm actually a little haunted by what I read, in a good way, because it's really taken me to a deeper level of thinking about the issues that you raise, which is a very complicated passage. But I love the quotes you had from Indo. But talk to us a little bit about how Indo brings out faith in that book.
Yeah, and again, I think I do give some, a lot away in this. It's hard to talk about without it, but there's still, again, this is also
disclaimer,
a book.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, right. But this book, like all great literature, it's about how it's told, not just what is told. And that's something that is a little confusing for readers, because it has a very complex narrative structure with differing points of view. And so that's something, that I do help readers with. I talk about how those different points of view and the different genres that are contained within the book can help us. Understanding those differences can help us to interpret the book. But the book is, it's simply about faith, in a very, very obvious way, where the main character is under threat of, horrific torture, is told to trample on the face of Christ, which in his culture would be, an act of blasphemy, an act of apostasy. And so he's faced with this test of actually, it's not even, he's other people are being threatened with torture if he doesn't do this. And so the very simple question is, if he does this, is he apostate? Has he actually lost his faith? And it's all sort of complicated because, the character is Jesuit. He's Roman Catholic. The writer is Catholic, and there is a different understanding of faith within Catholicism than within my own Protestant tradition. And so that's something I had to grapple with because I'm writing as a Protestant and for, I think, mainly Protestant readers. And yet I still think that this idea of what constitutes true faith, what constitutes a saving faith, is a question. We may not be 17th century Christians living in Japan being tortured for our faith, praise the Lord. But we still, even more so, as much so, we have to ask, what is faith? Is my faith a saving faith or not? And so I focus my exploration of the virtue of faith on that question, and of course talk about this novel, which is so haunting, as you said, and so complicated, and it does not get all tied up in a neat bow at all. But that's one of the points that I make, is that literature, because it does reflect real life, is complicated. Good literature shows the complexities of the human experience, and we shouldn't have to have all the things in the book tied up in a neat bow, because our own lives are usually not like that either. And so that's one of the other great gifts of great literature, is that it can cause us to ask these big questions about ourselves. And so that's where the answers are really important, more than in coming up with some solution to the questions posed by the characters and the plots.
I agree, and I love that you got inside the character's head, you got inside the author's head, which subsequently you got inside my head. So it was very good. But the other one, and I would say this is probably the first book I read. It might have been Moby Dick, but the first book I read that really moved me to the point of, I read the book and put it down stunned. And that was Tale of Two Cities. That final speech, that final kind of switcheroo, the climax and I was stunned at the end of that book. Never read it in high school, never heard anyone talk about it, just read it, because I went on this, kind of geeky literature, book nerdy thing that I do. I now do reading resolutions. So every year, I might be like, this year I'm going to read all Hemingway. This year I'm going to read all Steinbeck. And that's every once in a while it becomes I'm going to read all the unread books, and that never goes well. Yeah, in my library. But I always get defeated on that one. But you talk about justice as linked, and this will be the final one that I highlight specifically. But you talk about Tale of Two Cities there. Can you unpack the connection there and some of your findings? And guys, by the way, we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg of this book. But I mean, it reminded me of when I'm reading things that see it. I mean, this is a big compliment, I know, Karen, but it went to the level for me of the type of thinking I have to do when I'm reading C.S. Lewis. I just felt it was that well written, your book. I was super excited, devoured it, boom, couldn't wait for this interview. Well done, but it really made me think. And so I loved what I would consider the first great work of literature that just really affected me, really impacted me. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. That's a huge compliment, and I accept it very, very gratefully. So I focus on the virtue of justice when I talk about A Tale of Two Cities. And justice is different from all the other virtues because all of the other virtues pertain only to individual character. Only a person can be courageous or temperate or humble. A person can be just and should be just, and it is an individual virtue. But justice is also a virtue of a community or a city or a polis in Greek terms. And so already it's complicated because we're talking about individual justice and then community justice. So I had to, try to address both of those aspects of justice. And like all of the other virtues, justice is a mean between two extremes, and when it comes to our own character, our character is just when we are exhibit the mean between selfishness and selflessness. Now, I mean, we think of selflessness today as kind of, oh, that's like you can never be too selfless. Well, that's actually not true, because if we're completely self-effacing or self-denigrating, then we really aren't being who we are supposed to be, as human beings created in God's image. He has a call for us. He made us for a reason. So we should not erase ourselves completely. And so that's just sort of the beginning framework for thinking about justice, is that mean between selfishness and selflessness. And then when you magnify that, on a communal scale and start weighing all of the competing interests and needs of everyone in a community, it really gets complicated. And I'm just an English professor. I'm not like a political scientist, but that's why I think that A Tale of Two Cities addresses these tensions so well, because, if anyone knows anything about the two cities, Dickens is writing about the French Revolution in Paris. And then he's also writing about, the parallel events going on in his own country, in England at the same time. Of course, he's writing a century later, but he shows these two cities in parallel to one another, because he's actually afraid that his own country, England, is, because of its excesses, could repeat some of the same sins and excesses of the French Revolution.
Interesting.
And so, we know that the French Revolution started out with good intentions and an attempt to correct injustices, but it went too far in the opposite extreme and ended up committing its own injustices.
Which is very relevant today. Well, I mean, the whole book makes you think. And, if you were to talk to, obviously our audience is church planners, and my thought is always that I want to shape the church planner and I've always told anyone who's going to be communicating the gospel, anyone who's going to be preaching, anyone who's going to be connecting with unchurched culture, that you need to, we have this idea that everybody nowadays is a dumbed down idiot and they just binge Netflix all day. It's not true. I lived for 12 years in the UK. And, when you met smart people, you met really smart people. I worked in factories and met people that the only thing they had ever read in their entire life was a sports section in the newspaper on their factory break. Then I had other people where you'd ask them, what are you reading? They're saying, well, I'm reading a science fiction trilogy written in French. And you're thinking, wow, you're a buff, and I don't even know where to begin with you. But our culture is such a cross-section. And I think if we believe the lie that we're being told that everybody's just playing Candy Crush all day on their phone, then we're going to miss a cross-section of culture who is longing, kind of like C.S. Lewis tapped into, for an intelligent, thinking man's gospel as well. Not just to entertain you on stage and tell some funny jokes and throw the gospel in, but literally people that are, and I think this is part of our job as preachers, as, I'm maybe I'm answering my own question. I'm going to ask you the question. What would be the importance, just specifically to our church planners, in regards to grabbing hold of this great literature? And where would you tell someone to start?
Great question. I mean, I agree with you that sometimes our expectations are set too low. I mean, my own personal teaching philosophy is basically meet people where they are and take them where they should be. I mean, so it's both. You don't just meet people where they are and leave them where they are. I mean, people do want more, but they sometimes need to be equipped and encouraged, and they need to actually have their appetites and desires formed in the right way, which is what virtue ethics is all about. Is about creating good habits and practicing them enough so that those habits become part of our character. Well, if we are a community, and so when we develop our habits and our appetites and our desires in community, so we can also change them in community. And so Yeah, I did. I wrote this book. It is meaty. It is, I do teach literature at the college level, but I tried to write it in a way that would attract those readers, but also be an introduction for those who feel intimidated by reading great literature, don't know where to begin or how to begin. I actually include discussion questions in the back. I'm, very teacherly fashion, so that could be used by an individual reader or in a book club. There are also some great books out there by Christians about churches having book clubs, and not Bible studies. We need those, but I mean actually as an extra activity, like studying literature together in order to glean these kinds of insights that God offers us through these works that give glory to His truth and His creation. And so I think we have to just want to have more, and then there are lots of tools out there and other people who do too, and we can equip one another and just step by step. And you don't have to start with War and Peace. Read The Great Gatsby or Ethan Frome, which are both short novels that I write about in this book that are very deep and very profound, but not difficult to read, but yet still have lots of great questions to ponder and think about. And read something that you find interesting, because there's so much great literature out there. You're not going to get as much out of it if you're not getting some pleasure from it. But that also doesn't mean shying away from a challenge. It may take you longer. You might have to reread. I reread sentences all the time. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. There's more there than I first glanced. I've got to reread that. It's not a race. Reading great literature is not a race. It's not fast food. It's a several course gourmet meal.
It's an investment, really, and it's an investment in your mind, in your soul, and I believe connections with the lost. Just a little side note, I accidentally planted a church years ago in a Borders Books doing a reading group in the Starbucks there. So
oh, wow.
I'm a huge believer in reading books together with non-believers to connect and to talk through these things. So I love the idea of using this as even a reading group book. I think that would work. In my experience, that would definitely be something that could be done. So guys, thanks so much for tuning in today. My guest today has been Karen Swallow Prior. The book is On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And where can people connect with you if they want to reach out and tell you how much they appreciate it, or even find some other stuff you've written?
Sure. I have a website, KarenSwallowPrior.com. And I'm on Twitter way more than I should be. And it's KS Prior, KSPRIOR.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for Hardcore Church Planting. Arnold, sign us out.
Remember, if you are called to church planting, go hardcore or go home.
Hey, I want to give a big shout out to our number one sponsor. They've been with us for years. I know them personally. The founder is Josh Henry. He is an ex-church planner. If you wonder why we have so much fun with SimplifyChurch.com's ads, it's simply because we love these guys. We believe in them. I have used them. Gosh, as a church planner, I found them and have been using them for donkey's years. And if you don't know, that means a really long time. So head on over to SimplifyChurch.com. They're going to help you do all the stuff that you need to do, but nobody taught you to do in seminary. Things like bookkeeping, payroll, dealing with the IRS, making sure you're compliant, sending end of year donor receipts. If you haven't done that yet, 'tis the season. You have until the end of January to get those out to your people. So make sure you head on over to SimplifyChurch.com and let them simplify your church.
You've been listening to Hardcore Church Planting. Hardcore Church Planting has been brought to you by the Church Planter Podcast and the Church Planter Magazine, which is available in the App Store for both Apple and Android devices. If you like this episode, leave us a positive review. If you didn't like this episode, we'll be happy to give you your money back.